Hey guys, tonight we're going deep into the royal bedrooms, behind the cathedral curtains, and yes, right into the mud-soaked madness of the most perverted kings in medieval history. You lie back, but the velvet sheets are stained, and the whispers echo far beyond the stone corridors. You pass a flickering torchlight, and somewhere just out of sight, someone's bathing in goat milk. Naked servants are giggling. A man in a crown is arguing with a jester about whether rose petals taste better soaked in wine or sweat. You're not ready, but too bad, you're already in. You push open the heavy wooden door and step into the steamy, perfumed haze of Edward II's personal bathhouse. Yes, that Edward II of England. The unlucky monarch whose reign was defined not just by his disastrous political decisions, but also by the rumors swirling around his bedroom. And his bath. And his terrifying fondness for a man named Piers Gaveston. There he is, Edward, reclining in a shallow tub, surrounded by gilded mirrors and half-naked attendants. He's sipping spiced wine, giving a sly smile to Piers, who's leaning on a towel rack that probably cost more than a peasant's entire lifetime. You weren't expecting this level of intimacy, were you? Edward's court was scandalous even by medieval standards, and that's saying something for an era when nobles casually used dried crocodile dung as sunscreen. His devotion to Gaveston, his childhood companion and later court favorite, was less brotherly loyalty, and more wildly inappropriate crush. Historians still argue whether Edward and Piers were lovers in the full sense, but the public perception was unmistakably steamy. The nobles hated Gaveston for his arrogance, but what truly offended them was Edward's open, almost theatrical adoration. Think matching outfits, pet names, and a level of emotional oversharing usually reserved for teenage diaries. At one point, Edward gave Gaveston so many titles and lands that the other barons essentially staged a royal intervention. Their version of an intervention, by the way, included exile and eventual execution. Medieval nobles didn't do things halfway. You shuffle closer, trying not to trip over a discarded ermine robe. The scent of lavender oil fills the air, but under it, something faintly rancid lurks. Edward didn't just indulge in sensual comforts, he wallowed in them. He had fountains in his garden that spouted wine instead of water, and some records suggest he once commissioned a heated bath to be filled with honey and herbs for medicinal purposes. Right. Medicinal. Even the chroniclers at the time, who were usually pretty chill about royal eccentricities, couldn't ignore the weird vibe of Edward's household. One monk described it as a place where male courtiers dressed like brides, and the king never supped without his favorite man stroking his hair. You can't help but picture Edward pouting into his goblet while Gaveston played him lute ballads about loyalty and lust. Political matters? Meh. War with Scotland? Whatever. His bathwater had gone lukewarm and the petals were off color. Surely that was more urgent. The nobles finally snapped. After Gaveston was killed, some say disemboweled while wearing a robe gifted by Edward, the king never quite recovered. His reign descended into chaos. His marriage to Isabella of France turned from political alliance to outright warfare. And not metaphorically, she literally raised an army to dethrone him. That's medieval divorce for you. But what happened next might be worse than all the scandal. According to some accounts, Edward was captured and imprisoned in a damp, miserable cell, no velvet, no peers, no scented oils. Just rats. Then came the infamous story that his enemies executed him by inserting a red-hot poker into a rather private area, as poetic revenge for his unnatural preferences. Now, historians still debate whether that tale is fact or just a lurid smear campaign. There's no definitive proof. But the very existence of the rumor tells you a lot about how Edward's reign, and his appetites, were perceived by his enemies. The bathhouse grows quieter now. The steam thins. Edward leans back, eyes heavy. You can almost hear his sigh as the past slips away. But don't get too cozy. This is just the shallow end. You barely have time to dry off before you're whisked across the channel, through swirling mists, candlelit palaces, and the scent of rosewater gone stale, into the silk-draped nightmare of Charles VI of France, better known to his trembling courtiers as Charles the Mad. You arrive in the late 14th century, at a masquerade ball that feels more fever dream than festivity. Velvet masks, silver goblets, and torchlight flickering off walls painted with grotesques. The music plays, but it's off-key. And the king? He's twirling, half-naked beneath layers of fox fur, whispering to a suit of armor that he thinks is his brother. It's fine. Everything's fine. Charles was crowned young and looked the part, tall, golden-haired, and disturbingly handsome in the way marble statues are. But not long after his coronation, his mind began to slide like wet parchment. One day he was holding court, the next, he was attacking his own knights in the forest, convinced they were traitors made of glass. Yes, glass. He once refused to be touched, absolutely convinced his body would shatter like a goblet if someone bumped into him. Armor was out. Hugs were banned. Even bed sheets had to be gently draped across him like he was an extremely paranoid chandelier. Historians still argue whether Charles suffered from schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or perhaps something uniquely medieval in its madness. The royal doctors, who basically applied leeches and crossed their fingers, weren't much help. But beneath all that fragility, pure decadence. Charles wasn't just mad, he was delightfully, obscenely indulgent. He hosted wild men dances in which nobles dressed in flammable fur soaked in pitch, howling in mock savagery. One of these masquerades, called the Bal d'Ardence, ended in horrifying disaster when a torch came too close and half the dancers burst into flame. Several died. Charles. He survived. Burned, shaken, and quietly giggling. That party, by the way, was his way of cheering himself up. You pass into his private chamber now, where the tapestries depict forest nymphs in poses that would get you banned from any respectable museum. The bed is so large it has its own staircase. And in the corner, a royal scribe writes frantically, recording Charles's latest decree that a river upstream be blessed, because he's decided it's flirting with him. But the most scandalous part wasn't even Charles's madness, it was what happened because of it. While the king descended into obsession with invisible enemies and see-through bones, his wife Isabeau of Bavaria, sharp, beautiful, and perpetually exasperated, stepped in. She began making key decisions. Which soon became all the decisions. Which soon became rumors. Nobles whispered about her affairs with Charles's brother, Louis of Orleans. The court poets got vicious. One wrote that, the queen holds court in her lap. Subtle, right? Eventually, the scandal exploded into full civil war between two factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. Not over taxes. Not over policy. But over who got to control the king's broken mind and neglected bedchamber. And Charles? He sat in a corner, stroking a cat he didn't own, insisting he was St. George. Here's your fun, fringe tidbit, Charles also commissioned a secret chamber filled entirely with mirrors, where he could spend hours watching himself whisper. Some say he believed his reflections were other versions of him from different times. Others say he thought they were lovers. Some evenings, he would sit in their nude, swaying gently, waiting for the mirror people to reply. You'd think the kingdom would crumble under all this madness. You wouldn't be wrong. The 100 Years' War was raging. England was circling like a vulture. France was bleeding. And still, Charles danced. He died slowly, and strangely peacefully, after years of flickering between lucidity and delirium. By the end, even his enemies pitied him. The king who once ruled Paris like a lion had become a whispering ghost in a golden cage. But you, well, you leave just as the music starts up again. Another masked ball. Another night of perfume, fire, and dangerous silk. Because this journey, we're just getting warmed up. You stumble from Charles's firelit palace and find yourself enveloped in something entirely different. It's hotter here, oppressive, sticky, perfumed in a way that doesn't feel quite right. Rosewater, sandalwood, and the faint whiff of overripe melons. Welcome to the Ottoman Empire in the mid-1600s. Welcome to the gilded, padded, silk-drenched world of Sultan Ibrahim I, better known by a name whispered nervously in the corridors of the palace, Ibrahim the Mad. He didn't start that way. For the first 23 years of his life, Ibrahim lived inside the infamous Kafes or cage, a private, locked section of the Topkapi Palace reserved for royal sons who were not chosen to rule. Imagine a golden prison padded with paranoia and the sound of executions happening just beyond the silk curtains. When his brother died, the court reluctantly pulled Ibrahim out of the cage to crown him sultan. They expected him to rule. He had other plans. You follow him now through corridors lined with gold leaf, eunuchs shuffling silently past. The palace is warm, almost womb-like, but the energy is thick. This is a place where secrets sweat through the walls. At the heart of it all is the imperial harem. Under Ibrahim, the harem didn't just grow, it exploded. Hundreds of concubines, all selected with bizarrely specific tastes. Fat women. Thin women. Women with red hair, or green eyes, or backs shaped like crescents. One woman, according to legend, was selected for her resemblance to a particular species of fish. You don't ask questions. You just keep walking. And then you see it, the melon room. No, really. Ibrahim reportedly developed a passionate obsession with melons. He would examine them, caress them, demand his advisors offer opinions on their sexual essence. Some said he believed melons held spiritual power. Others said he was just very, very bored. One day, he threw a lavish ceremony where courtiers had to bow before a watermelon. You imagine that meeting of ministers. One man bows, another cries, and somewhere in the background, a concubine bites her lip to stop laughing. But the darker parts are harder to laugh at. Ibrahim, in a fit of fury, or possibly erotic frustration, once ordered 280 concubines drowned in the Bosphorus. They were disloyal, he claimed. Or perhaps too loyal to one another. No one ever truly knew. Witnesses say the water ran red for hours. Historians still argue whether the massacre actually happened or was exaggerated by Western sources who love to paint the Ottomans as savages. But the record survives, stained with mystery and horror. And in the wake of this horror, one woman rose like a ghost in a perfume cloud, Turhan Sultan, one of Ibrahim's favorites. She was cunning, patient, and perhaps even compassionate, eventually becoming queen regent after Ibrahim was removed. Which brings us to the final chapter of this candlelit calamity. You're ushered into the Sultan's private chamber, where he lies sprawled on silk cushions, dressed in robes embroidered with tiny lions and serpents. A concubine fans him lazily. A bowl of dates sits untouched. He's whispering to a bird. Not a real bird. A jeweled one, perched on a melon. Eventually, his mother, yes, his mother, couldn't take it anymore. She arranged for his deposition. Ibrahim was strangled with a bowstring in his own chamber, ending a reign that was more fever dream than political strategy. The Ottoman Empire would recover. It always did. But the echoes of Ibrahim's reign linger. The drowned girls. The melons. The golden cage that created a man too fragile and too wild to wield power. You retreat through the palace, heart pounding softly, feet brushing over a mosaic that depicts roses, swords, and something else, something you're too tired to name. There are stranger kings still to come. The scent of rosewater and drowning regret is still clinging to your sleeves when the temperature drops, sharply. You step out of the harem's suffocating luxury and into something raw and elemental. Fur. Iron. Wood smoke. Welcome to the north. You stand beneath a sky the color of old pewter, wind whipping across the fjords. Seagulls shriek, not from hunger but perhaps out of moral discomfort. You're in the lands once ruled by Harald Bluetooth, the Viking king of Denmark and Norway, yes, the guy who gave his name to your phone's wireless setting. But tonight isn't about data transmission. It's about flesh, and faith, and things that would make your Catholic grandmother spontaneously combust. Harald ruled in the 10th century, a time when Christianity was creeping into the Norse world, politely asking to be let in while Viking priests danced around bonfires in antler helmets. And Harald? He had a foot in both camps. He accepted Christianity publicly but didn't exactly purge the pagan pleasure circuits. Instead, he threw fusion festivals, a little Christ, a little Odin, a whole lot of fermented fish and regrettable behavior. You're standing now in one of his long halls. Animal pelts line the walls. The fire pit crackles. There's a drinking horn being passed around that smells like someone fermented a goat inside a shoe. Harald sits at the far end, draped in wolfskin and wearing a grin that suggests he's already halfway into some divine mischief. He raises a cup and declares something in Old Norse that makes the crowd roar. Someone throws off their tunic. Another bangs a shield. Tonight is for Blot, a ritual sacrifice and feast that involved drinking, dancing, and occasionally swapping wives under the approving gaze of a blood-smeared idol. Historians still argue whether these public wife loans were mandatory or simply encouraged by peer pressure and 6 pints of mead, but the sagas make one thing clear: nobody went home early. Harald's religious double life created a kind of licentious loophole. He could appease Rome with a church bell in one village, while hosting a fertility rite involving a fake boar and questionable chanting in another. And then there's the rune stones, great granite slabs inscribed with achievements, prayers, and the occasional coded brag. One stone from Harald's reign literally claims he won all of Denmark and made the Danes Christian. No mention of the sacred orgy in the same village square 3 days later, of course. Now for the quirky tidbit: there's a legend, unverified but persistent, that Harald commissioned a ceremonial cloak lined with the hair of his concubines. Supposedly woven in spiral patterns to mimic Norse knotwork, it was worn only during high feasts and orgies blessed by local shamans. You try not to picture it. You fail. Back to the feast, because we're not done. Across the hall, a storyteller is describing how Harald once challenged a rival king to a duel using runed phallus carvings instead of swords. Symbolic warfare, he called it. The loser had to publicly praise the winner's strength in front of their wives. Diplomacy, Viking style. But Harald wasn't just a horny warlord in a bear hat. He was a smart, slippery ruler who knew how to manipulate symbols. His conversion to Christianity, while perhaps sincere, was also strategic. It got him political legitimacy, foreign alliances, and a useful excuse to wear gold crosses while still sacrificing goats behind the church. Still, it made enemies. Eventually, his own son, Sweyn Forkbeard, rebelled against him. Civil war broke out. Swords were drawn. Fathers cursed sons. And in 986, Harold died, probably from wounds received while running away from his own son's army. You know, classic family stuff. But legend says that just before fleeing, he conducted one last midnight ritual, a marriage between fire and snow, symbolized by pouring ale over a red-hot sword plunged into a snowbank. Was it a farewell to his pagan roots? A final magical boast? Or just Harold being theatrical as always? No one knows. But that sword, supposedly buried with him, along with at least 3 of his ceremonial wives, and a cloak that probably still smells like mead, regret, and wolf breath. You step back into the wind, your hair full of ash and your head full of runes. The sagas are singing, but softly now. And somewhere in the north, a long-forgotten god raises a cup in your honor. You don't drink. You're pacing yourself. After all, we haven't even gotten to the Pope's sex parties yet. You shiver the last of the Norse wind off your shoulders and step straight into candlelight, thick, golden, and reeking faintly of incense and hypocrisy. This is Rome. And not just any Rome. This is the 10th century Vatican, where celibacy was an ideal and sin was a party theme. Welcome to the papacy of John XII, often described, without much exaggeration, as the most degenerate pope in Catholic history. But this story isn't just about John. It's about his sleazy tag team with a king named Berenger of Ivrea, a man so slick he made political betrayal look like a form of foreplay. You pass under archways depicting saints and martyrs and into the Lateran Palace, where behind a door guarded by a man who's definitely asleep on the job, you find the Pope, barefoot, shirtless, and surrounded by women who are definitely not here for confession. John XII became Pope at just 18, which already tells you something. Teenagers shouldn't run churches. Or empires. Or really, anything involving keys and trust. His papal name should have been Yikes I. He was a prince, a pope, and a hormonal disaster all rolled into one. Under his rule, the Lateran was less a palace and more a brothel with good lighting. One chronicler described John's court as a harem of prostitutes, gamblers, and pagan dancers. He held orgies on saints' feast days. He toasted to Bacchus and Venus. He gambled in full papal regalia, swearing at dice when he lost and then making up new rules when he didn't like the results. And then there's Berenger, officially a nobleman, unofficially the Vatican's chaos concierge. Berenger of Ivrea was a schemer's schemer. He married into power, broke oaths like they were breadsticks, and had an unsettling knack for always being in the room where bad decisions happened. He and Pope John. Kindred spirits. One provided the titles, the other provided the muscle. Together, they created a Vatican more focused on flesh than faith. Now for the juicy tidbit. Rumor has it that John XII once ordained a 10-year-old as bishop just to win a bet. The child fainted during the ceremony. Someone mistook it for a miracle. The kid later went into beekeeping. You try to follow the politics, but it's like tracing spilled wine on a tapestry. John crowns Berenger as Holy Roman Emperor. Then uncrowns him. Then recrowns someone else. Then possibly sleeps with someone's wife at the coronation. Honestly, keeping track of loyalties in 10th century Rome is like trying to name all the Kardashians after 3 glasses of communion wine. Historians still argue whether John's hedonism was just youthful recklessness or a deliberate rejection of church restraint. Some believe he saw the papacy as a divine gift to enjoy earthly pleasures. Others think he was simply bored and very, very horny. Eventually, the church got tired of his antics. A synod convened to list his crimes, and reader, it was not short. Theft. Arson. Blinding opponents. Sleeping with his own niece. Turning the Vatican into what was essentially a live-action Roman soap opera. And how did John respond? He laughed. Then, while the council tried to depose him, he threw another party. A big one. With fire jugglers. Inside a cathedral. You peek into the chamber. There's John, lying on a velvet couch, eating figs fed to him by a dancer in a halo crown. A bishop is playing the lute. No one's wearing shoes. Or pants. Then, the end comes, suddenly and stupidly. One version says he died mid-romp with a married woman, suffering a stroke and tumbling out of bed. Another claims he was beaten to death by her husband. Either way, not exactly a saintly farewell. He was buried quietly. No fanfare. No golden tomb. Just a quick ceremony so the church could move on, fast and furiously. Berenger. He slithered off to start more wars. The man had the survival instincts of a cockroach and the charm of a wet dagger. And you? You step away from the velvet and vice, heart pounding with too much second-hand incense. You pass frescoes that weep blood in the moonlight, or maybe that's just wine splashed from the last banquet. The church survived. It always did. But under John XII, it had one hell of a hangover. And you haven't even met the king who enjoyed crawling on all fours yet. The incense fades, the wine runs dry, and the orgiastic murmurs of Rome retreat into silence. Now you find yourself under a gray sky, ankle-deep in slush, trudging toward a bleak stone fortress perched high in the Alps. The glamour is gone. The firelight is cold. And the king you're about to meet? He's on his knees. Again. This is the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, and if he's not crawling toward forgiveness barefoot in the snow, he's probably still begging someone, anyone, to forgive him for something he may or may not have enjoyed a bit too much. Henry ruled from the mid-11th century, a man caught between church and state, sword and staff. But tonight, you meet him during his strangest public performance, the infamous trek to Canossa in 1077. The ultimate act of royal penance. He had angered Pope Gregory VII by asserting the right to appoint bishops, which, in medieval Europe, was like claiming you could pick your own referee and still call it a fair fight. Gregory excommunicated him. Bad news. Excommunication meant no rule, no respect, and worst of all, no power over anyone, not even your servants. They could ignore your orders. And many did. So what did Henry do? He dressed in a plain wool tunic, walked barefoot across the Alps in winter, and stood outside the castle of Canossa for 3 straight days, begging for forgiveness. It sounds noble. Humble. Even spiritual. But let's be honest, you're picturing it now, aren't you? A king with frozen toes, shivering in the snow while the Pope peeks through the shutters, sipping hot wine and deciding whether to let him in. It's the most medieval power move of all time. And Henry? He did it with enthusiasm that, frankly, made some people uncomfortable. Historians still argue whether Henry's display of devotion was genuine, or if he took a little too much pleasure in the public groveling. Several chroniclers note that Henry seemed eager to crawl. One scribe even said he wept most fervently, as though every tear were offered to God, or an audience. You imagine him now, knees red, hands trembling, breath misting as he sobs out an apology to a man who's made him wait like a dog in a blizzard. Some say it was penance. Others say it was performance art. A few whisper that Henry's tastes leaned toward humiliation long before the snow. One fringe rumor. Henry insisted his robes be tied with a rope rather than a belt, like a penitent sinner, he said. But palace servants later gossiped that the rope was silk dyed to look humble, custom woven by his mistress. Religious cosplay, essentially. You move forward in time now, into the later years of his reign, when Henry's rule devolved into a parade of rebellions, betrayals, and more penitential theatrics. He was excommunicated multiple times, each time crawling back into someone's good graces like a man who'd memorized the choreography of repentance. Even his family turned on him. His sons, particularly Henry V, plotted behind his back, raising armies and forging alliances. And finally, humiliatingly, they forced him to abdicate. That's when things get weirder. The deposed emperor wandered from city to city, seeking refuge. Some accounts say he adopted a disguise. Others claim he spent time in a monastery under a false name, offering to scrub floors and attend confession multiple times a day. It's unclear whether he was seeking forgiveness, or something more tactile. And here's your quirky tidbit. One 12th century poem describes a masked figure at a local festival who publicly crawled across the square on all fours, moaning piously and begging for mock forgiveness. The punchline? Locals believed it was Henry himself, sneaking into town for one last hurrah. A royal with a kink for crawling. Eventually, Henry IV died excommunicated and unwanted, buried in a church that refused to consecrate the ground for weeks. The bells rang off-key. The procession was small. And somewhere, probably in Rome, Pope Gregory VII smiled in his grave. You step away from the snow, your feet aching in sympathy. Behind you, the sound of knees dragging through slush fades into memory. But don't get smug. The next royal doesn't crawl. He dances. In heels. You follow the trail of penance and cold knees straight into something far more theatrical. The air warms again, heavy with myrrh, sweat, and something stranger. You're in ancient Rome, yes, the empire, but make no mistake, this ruler doesn't resemble any toga-wearing Caesar from the schoolbooks. This is Elagabalus. And you've just stepped into his scented labyrinth. Elagabalus wasn't technically medieval, he ruled in the early 3rd century, but honestly, there's no historical timeline strict enough to keep him out of a story like this. Because what he lacked in chivalry, he more than made up for in unfiltered chaos. Think Caligula meets Paris Fashion Week meets sacrificial altars, all filtered through a 14-year-old boy who somehow became emperor. You enter the Domus Elagabali, the palace that functioned less like an imperial residence and more like a cross-dressing nightclub in a burning cathedral. Elagabalus, born Varius Avitus Bassianus, crowned at just 14, believed himself to be the living embodiment of the Syrian sun god Elagabal. Which meant he didn't rule Rome. He blessed it. With fireworks. And furs. And a lot of very confused senators. He wore makeup, elaborate wigs, and flowing silk gowns that would have made Cleopatra blush. He preferred being called lady, frequently declared his intent to transition, though in words far older than ours, and asked his physicians to perform what may have been history's first recorded request for gender-affirming surgery. They declined. Rudely. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus should be considered transgender, gender fluid, or simply a rebellious teen with too much eyeliner and too much power. What they do agree on is that he was not, by any standard, interested in ruling Rome like a proper emperor. He married several times, women and men. He once threw a public wedding to his male charioteer and declared himself the bride. Not just figuratively. He wore a veil and asked senators to help carry his train. At banquets, he would serve guests dishes made entirely of animal tongues or flamingo brains. But he was nothing if not generous. He's said to have hosted parties where guests were buried under petals released from hidden ceiling chambers. Sounds lovely, until you realize several guests suffocated under the floral deluge. Petals. Asphyxiation. Tuesday night, basically. Your quirky tidbit. He once filled an entire swimming pool with perfumed oil, not water. Then, he floated across it in a raft covered in rose petals while court musicians played. The goal? To recreate the journey of the gods across the heavenly sky. Guests were expected to cheer. You shuffle past the pool now, which still smells vaguely of geraniums and spilled ego. Oh, and let's not forget his God Rock, a giant black meteorite hauled from Syria and enshrined in a gold chariot. Elagabalus demanded it be worshipped as the sun itself. He danced around it in sheer robes. Senators were forced to participate, bowing and offering sacrifices. One unfortunate noble reportedly tripped mid-offering and was trampled to death by a sacred goat. Elagabalus responded by clapping. He loved a good accident. The Roman elite hated him. Not just for his identity or his personal habits, but for his utter disregard for anything sacred to Roman tradition. The Senate was a joke to him. He restructured priesthoods, banned pork temporarily, and once ordered an entire town to shave their heads because his dream that week featured a bald god. Eventually, even his own grandmother, who had helped secure his throne, turned against him. She'd hoped for a docile puppet. Instead, she got Studio 54 in a temple robe. His downfall came swiftly. At 18, barely 4 years into his reign, he was assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard. He and his mother were dragged from hiding, murdered, and their bodies dumped in the Tiber River. Even in death, Rome sought to erase him. His images were destroyed. His name scratched from monuments. His reign declared a stain on imperial dignity. But here's the thing, you stand there now, staring at the empty dais where he once danced in heels and incense smoke, and you can't quite shake the feeling that Elagabalus wanted to be remembered this way. Not as a ruler, but as a disruption. A divine spark. A glittery mess with a god complex. And maybe, just maybe, you admire him a little. The petals crunch underfoot as you walk away. The party's over. The perfume lingers. But don't relax. The next king you meet doesn't wear silk. He wears blood. The sweet scent of roses fades behind you. In its place, a colder wind creeps in, sharper, quieter, and unsettling. You've just exited the domed madness of Elagabalus's palace and entered a world far more disciplined, but no less disturbing. The halls are dim. The walls, thick. The footsteps echo beneath vaulted ceilings like whispered warnings. This is medieval France. And this is Gilles de Rice. Forget the courtly romances and chivalrous knights. Gilles was no charming noble. He was the boogeyman in polished armor. A decorated soldier. A national hero. A companion of Joan of Arc. And also, quite possibly the most horrifying nobleman in European history. You creep through the crumbling keep of Château de Tiffauges, his infamous castle. It's hard to imagine, but once this place echoed with laughter, music, and the sound of tiny feet running down its halls. Children. Lots of them. But let's not start there. Not yet. Let's begin with the man before the monster. Gilles de Rais was born in 1405 into immense wealth. His family, the Montmorencys, were among the oldest and most powerful in France. After his parents died, he inherited vast lands and titles. He was brilliant, charming, and extremely well educated. At 16, he entered military service. By 25, he was fighting alongside Joan of Arc, riding into battle under the standard of a girl who claimed to speak with angels. He was loyal, fearless, and brutally effective. He was made a Marshal of France, one of the highest military honors. You pause before a dusty portrait, barely visible under candlelight. His eyes, sharp, intelligent, hungry, follow you. His golden curls frame a face that once graced royal courts. But that brilliance wouldn't last. Because after Joan was captured and burned, something inside Gilles cracked. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was power. Maybe it was a black, writhing hunger that had always been there, finally given permission to crawl out of its cage. He retired from war. Turned inward. And built himself a world where he could play God. And gods demand sacrifice. At first, his wealth went into art and theater. Elaborate, expensive productions that bankrupted him. He sold land. He borrowed. He even turned to alchemists, hoping to create gold when he could no longer buy it. But when none of it worked, his attention turned to the one resource he could still afford in abundance: children. At first, they were orphans. Peasant boys. Servant girls. Gilles would offer their desperate families positions in his household. Training. Food. Hope. And once inside his gates, they disappeared. You walk past an ancient stone staircase spiraling downward. It leads to a basement chamber, long sealed by the authorities. They say the walls were stained with blood. The floor, littered with bones. Eyewitnesses testified to screams. Torture. Rituals. Some said Gilles believed the blood of children could summon demons. That he sacrificed them in black masses. Others insisted he simply enjoyed it, watched the light leave their eyes like a stage play, performed only for him. The numbers vary. Some claim 30. Others say over 100. A few whispered more than 200. But no one knows for sure, because most of the bodies were never found. Only remnants. Fragments. Bits of bone hidden in furnaces and cesspits. He might have gotten away with it forever. Except he made the mistake of kidnapping a cleric's child. A boy with connections. A boy whose disappearance was noticed. By 1440, his crimes could no longer be ignored. He was arrested. Tried. And under pressure, and likely torture, he confessed. He admitted everything. In gruesome detail. Not just the killings, but the pleasure. The pride. The darkness that had swallowed him whole. Even the church couldn't save him. He was excommunicated, condemned by the crown, and sentenced to death. On October 26, 1440, Gilles de Rais was executed by hanging and burning in Nantes. Some say he repented in his final moments. Others say he wept only for himself. A strange footnote. Despite everything, locals later venerated him. Believed his soul was saved. Even thought he was innocent, a victim of politics. Statues were erected. A strange, selective amnesia. Proof that history doesn't always punish its monsters. Sometimes, it rewrites them. You step out of the castle ruins, and the night air feels thick. Heavy with the weight of unspeakable things. You can still hear the echoes of his laughter somewhere deep beneath the stone. But don't stop now. The road ahead leads not to a castle, but a field. And a man whose body would outlive his name. Your next encounter is less noble. More vagrant. But no less disturbing. You leave behind the noble houses and poisoned courts. No more velvet drapes or marble columns. Now, your path winds through a bleak, windswept field in 16th century Scotland, cold, muddy, and quiet. There are no palaces here. No armies. Just moorland and mist. And one man. Buried in legend. Drenched in blood. Sawney Bean. Even his name sounds like a nursery rhyme gone wrong. But Sawney Bean's story isn't one parents tell their children to help them sleep. It's the one they whisper to keep them awake. To keep them close to the fire. To make sure they don't stray too far from home. There are no royal decrees, no coronation robes in his tale. Just the black mouth of a cave and the lingering scent of salt, rot, and iron. You reach the Ayrshire coast, where cliffs rise like broken teeth from the sea. There, hidden among them, is the entrance to Benin Cave. Locals once swore it was cursed, haunted. That if you listened closely, you could hear, chewing. But let's rewind. According to legend, Alexander Sawney Bean was born in the late 14th or early 15th century. He came from humble, possibly criminal origins. One version says he was a tanner's son who grew tired of honest work. Another says he was a highwayman by trade. Either way, he fled society and took refuge in the cave with a woman just as twisted as he was. And there, they bred a dynasty. Not of nobility, but of incest. Sawney and his partner raised a brood of children and grandchildren, all born from each other, all raised in total darkness. Some say the family grew to over 45 people, living unseen for decades. An entire society, festering underground. But they needed to eat. And meat doesn't grow in caves. So they hunted. Not deer. Not boar. Humans. Travelers who took the wrong road. Merchants who strayed from the convoy. Lovers walking by moonlight. Sawney's clan would pounce from the dark, drag the screaming victims back to the cave, slit their throats, and feast. Arms were smoked like sausages. Legs salted for winter. Entrails tossed into the sea. If anything was left uneaten, it was dismembered and scattered across the rocks. Whole limbs washing ashore. Skulls found half buried in sand. At first, the authorities blamed wolves. Then bandits. Then witches. But the disappearances continued. Month after month. Year after year. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of men, women, and children vanished without a trace. The story only ends when a would-be victim, wealthy, armed, and lucky, fought back. He survived the attack and fled to Glasgow, where he raised alarm. A manhunt ensued. Dogs. Soldiers. The king himself, James VI of Scotland, is said to have led the search. And then, the cave was found. Inside, the torches revealed a nightmare. Human bones littered the floor like driftwood. Cured limbs hung from the ceiling. Barrels filled with pickled flesh. And in the corners, eyes blinking at the sudden light, stood the clan. Pale. Ragged. Hissing like animals. They were captured and brought to Edinburgh. No trial. No defense. Just execution. The women were burned. The men were dismembered. All were declared less than human. You stand now at the mouth of that very cave, peering into the darkness. Some say the tale is nothing more than folklore. English propaganda to smear the Scots. There's no court record. No physical evidence. Just oral tradition and the kind of fear that grows teeth over time. But still, the cave is real. The bones found there, also real. And travelers still go missing in the woods near Ayrshire from time to time. Coincidence? Or maybe the beans had survivors. Maybe something still stirs in that cold, wet dark. You step back, instinctively. The wind from the sea tastes of iron. And below, the waves smash against the rocks like gnashing teeth. You've seen enough of the shadows. Time to return to sunlight. To a place where death wore a crown and madness marched in gold. Next, we travel to the east. To a ruler whose bloodlust made Sawney look quaint. You've met monsters. Now meet a god in mortal form. His name was Zhu Hozhao, the Zhengde Emperor of Ming China. And he made the throne into a playroom of absolute chaos. You leave behind the moors of Scotland and step onto sunlit marble, warm underfoot. The air smells of sandalwood and ink, swirling with the scent of lacquered screens and rare spices. You are now in the Forbidden City, silent, immense, eternal. But something is off. You're not walking through the court of a Confucian sage. This isn't a place of order or balance. It's more like a circus tent. Or a theater. Maybe a tavern. And on the throne, lounging sideways, wine in one hand, tiger cub in the other, is Zhu Hozhao, the Zhengde Emperor. Born in 1491, Zhu Hozhao was groomed to rule the Ming dynasty, the most powerful empire in the world. He had scholars, tutors, generals, philosophers, all there to prepare him for a life of solemn statecraft. And he hated every second of it. Zhu Hozhao didn't want to be emperor. He wanted to be, literally anyone else. A warrior. A bandit. A fisherman. A shopkeeper. He was rich beyond imagination, but bored out of his skull. So, he created a game. And the empire? That was his toy box. At 15, he began disappearing from the palace for days. He'd sneak out of the Forbidden City in disguise, pretending to be a commoner, a general, even a horse trader. He renamed himself Zhu Shou and insisted everyone play along. Anyone who addressed him as emperor risked punishment. He wasn't ruling the world anymore, he was cosplaying in it. And when he got bored of pretending, he made things real. He created a shadow government called the Leopard Quarter, an inner palace staffed entirely by eunuchs, circus performers, and his drinking buddies. He gave lavish titles to people who could juggle, dance, or make him laugh. Need a minister of war? Here's a tightrope walker with a crossbow. The Leopard Quarter became infamous. There were leopards kept as pets, of course. Zhengde would ride them like hunting dogs through the gardens. But there were also orgies. Wrestling matches. Pig races. Boats made entirely of gold that he'd row through palace canals while dressed as a pirate. Meanwhile, the empire fell apart. Corruption ran rampant. Court officials were ignored or executed for questioning his choices. Bandits raided the countryside. The Mongols stirred at the borders. But Zhengde? He was too busy building a fake bazaar inside the palace, where he could shop with eunuchs pretending to be merchants. He'd haggle, overpay, and laugh himself hoarse, then go back to staging military drills where no one was allowed to lose unless it was funny. And yet, beneath all the absurdity was sharp intelligence. Junda wasn't stupid. He knew how to read documents. He spoke several languages. He could ride, fight, and command troops. In fact, when he did lead a military expedition against a Mongol uprising in 1517, he won, handily. But the moment he returned to Beijing, he built a mock battlefield in his backyard, complete with actors playing Mongol rebels, and reenacted the whole war. Night after night. Wearing a feathered hat and shouting, "I am General Zhu." Eventually, his recklessness caught up with him. In 1521, at the age of 29, he drowned in the Grand Canal after falling out of a boat, drunk, dressed like a fisherman, chasing an exotic animal he'd hoped to keep as a pet. His reign lasted only 16 years. But his legacy? It's legendary. Historians still argue, was he mad? Or just painfully bored? A spoiled child? Or a genius using performance art to mock the absurdity of imperial rule? You walk through the ghost of his palace now. The drums are silent. The leopard cages empty. But somewhere in the wind, you can almost hear laughter. And then, it fades. The court collapses around you, folding into smoke. Because your next stop is somewhere colder. Much colder. Steel echoes. Chains rattle. And above it all, a name, Peter the Great. But this isn't the Peter they write about in textbooks. Not the reformer. Not the shipbuilder. This is Peter the Terrifying. And you're about to meet the side of him no one dares remember. The fog clears and you feel it immediately, cold, deep in your bones. The kind that creeps under your skin and settles in your lungs. Your breath mists in the air, and towering above you is a figure carved of iron and ice. Welcome to Russia, and welcome to the court of Peter the Great. But this isn't the tidy portrait of the reformer who built St. Petersburg and brought Western science to a feudal nation. No powdered wig. No friendly shipbuilding stints in Holland. This is a different Peter, raw, violent, unstoppable. Born in 1672, Peter was 6'8", a giant in every sense. He moved like a storm and thought like a cannonball. From an early age, he was obsessed with control. Control over land, over people, and especially over himself. And when that control slipped, he punished. Hard. Let's start with his childhood games. Peter didn't play with toy soldiers. He built armies. As a teenager, he organized 300 boys into regiments, complete with uniforms and drills. These weren't innocent games, he used real guns. Real injuries. Real death. His court. A war camp. His playground. A battlefield. Once he took power, Peter realized that Russia, to survive, had to change. It was backward. Medieval. Isolated. So he forced modernization onto it like a hammer driving a nail through stone. He banned beards, literally had them shaved off in public. He outlawed traditional Russian clothing. Forced nobles to speak French. Enforced military service on the nobility and created a navy from nothing. And if you didn't cooperate? Well, Peter had a thing for torture. He built the secret chancellery, his private intelligence and punishment office, where confessions were extracted using methods that would make your teeth rattle. The rack. The wheel. burning tongs. Once, when he suspected a political plot, he had 1,182 people executed, many of them nobles. He personally took part in the killings, sword in hand, splattering his robes with blood. Because Peter didn't just rule through law. He ruled through fear. He even turned against his own son, Alexei. Alexei was a quiet, thoughtful man, not like his brutal father. He preferred books to battles. Faith to fists. And for that, Peter saw him as a threat. He accused Alexei of treason. Had him arrested. Tortured. And when the interrogations were done, Alexei died in prison, likely from injuries ordered by his own father. But here's the thing, Peter did transform Russia. He built the navy. Opened trade with Europe. Founded schools, hospitals, science academies. He modernized the calendar. Created the first standing army. He even carved a new capital out of a swamp, St. Petersburg, declaring it Russia's window to the west. Tens of thousands of serfs died digging its canals and hauling its stones, but Peter called it his masterpiece. So what do you do with a man like Peter? He gave his nation power, science, a place on the world stage. And he bought it with suffering. His own. His people's. His family's. At the end of his life, Peter tried to write a new law of succession. He wanted to name a worthy heir. But he died before signing it. So his death plunged Russia into chaos. And that, perhaps, was fitting. He had built his empire like a storm builds a castle. Majestic. But always at risk of blowing apart. As you walk through the snow-dusted ruins of his ambition, you pass a frozen canal, still edged with the stones laid by trembling hands. A chill wind whispers a truth few dare admit. Some kings conquer the world. Others conquer themselves. Peter tried to do both. And the scars run deep. But now the snow begins to melt. The ice fades from your eyelashes. And you find yourself not in a palace, but in a garden. Gentle winds. Blossoms. And in the center, an elderly woman with eyes like a hawk. Catherine is waiting. And not the great one, not yet. This is Catherine before the crown. And her story? It begins with betrayal, and ends with a throne drenched in blood. You step softly through the tall hedges of a manicured European garden. Everything here is orderly, too orderly, perhaps. Roses trimmed with mathematical precision. Gravel paths raked to perfection. Not a blade of grass out of place. But beyond this fragile calm, there is unrest. Because behind a closed door of a quiet Prussian estate, a young girl, barely 14, is about to be told she must marry Russia. Her name is Sophie Friederich August von Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornberg. But you'll come to know her by another name, Catherine the Great. She is not royal. Not wealthy. Barely noble. But she is sharp. Observant. Ambitious in ways no one yet understands. She listens closely as her mother explains, Russia's heir, the awkward and sickly Peter III, needs a bride. Sophie has been chosen. And what does Sophie say? Nothing. She nods. She obeys. She leaves her childhood behind without a glance. Because this girl, she knows the game she's playing. When she arrives in Russia, she's met with suspicion. She's foreign, she's Lutheran, she's far too clever. The Empress Elizabeth, ruler of Russia at the time, watches her like a hawk. Sophie converts to Orthodoxy, learns Russian, changes her name to Ekaterina Alexievna, Catherine. She reads. She studies. She waits. Peter, her new husband, is a disaster. He idolizes Frederick the Great of Prussia, Russia's enemy, plays with toy soldiers, and drinks himself into incoherent rages. He mocks Catherine in public, humiliates her in private, and makes no effort to consummate their marriage. So Catherine turns elsewhere, for love, for conversation, for strategy. She builds relationships with guards, nobles, intellectuals. Quietly, carefully, she constructs a web of loyalty. Years pass. Empress Elizabeth dies. Peter becomes Tsar. And immediately, he makes enemies. He alienates the army by withdrawing from Russia's hard-fought war with Prussia. He offends the church. He plans reforms that terrify the nobility. And through it all, he ignores his wife, still seeing her as a shadow in the corridor. But that shadow is about to become a storm. On July 9, 1762, while Peter is away at his summer palace, Catherine strikes. With the support of the Imperial Guard and her lover, Grigory Orlov, she marches into St. Petersburg. She is crowned empress not through inheritance, not through marriage, but by military coup. Peter is arrested. Days later, he dies in captivity. Hemorrhoidal colic, the report says. But few believe that. Most suspect Catherine's men had him quietly strangled. Now, Catherine stands alone at the center of power. And what does she do? She transforms an empire. She writes treatises on law, champions Enlightenment ideals, corresponds with Voltaire and Diderot. She establishes the Smolny Institute, the first state-funded school for girls in Russia. She builds libraries, sponsors the arts, reforms the bureaucracy. She codifies laws, modernizes agriculture, opens new hospitals. And yes, she also expands Russia's borders, conquering Crimea, parts of Poland, and much of the Black Sea coast. But her reign isn't pure light. She faces uprisings, like the Pugachev rebellion, in which a Cossack peasant claims to be her dead husband Peter III and rallies thousands. Catherine crushes it with brutal efficiency. She promises to free the serfs, but doesn't. In fact, under her reign, serfdom expands. Her Enlightenment talk grows quieter as the threats to her throne grow louder. And her personal life? A battlefield of its own. Catherine takes many lovers, some powerful, some pitiful. She showers them with titles and lands, then casts them aside when they no longer serve her. Some whisper scandal. Some admire her freedom. All fear her mind. Because Catherine didn't just outlive her enemies. She outthought them. When she dies in 1796, after 34 years on the throne, she leaves behind a Russia vastly more powerful, educated, and modern than the one she inherited. But she also leaves behind a contradiction. An Enlightenment queen who ruled as an autocrat. A reformer who entrenched inequality. A woman who seized power in a world designed to keep her powerless. So as the sun sets on her garden of power and paradox, you pass into shadow again. This time, the stones beneath your feet are ancient. Jungle vines creep along a temple wall. And deep within the tomb of Palenque, a red powder stains the sarcophagus of a woman whose name we do not know. But whose story, like Catherine's, echoes beyond time. You are walking through dense, humid jungle. The air is thick with the scent of earth, orchids, and thyme. A howler monkey screams in the distance. Under your feet, the mossy stones are ancient, carved long ago by hands now dust. Then, like something out of a dream, the trees part. And there she is. The temple of the inscriptions in Palenque, rising above the canopy like a sleeping god. Tiered and steep, built with impossible precision, it guards something buried, something forgotten, yet waiting to be remembered. Because beneath this temple lies the Red Queen. She was found in 1994. A stone sarcophagus, hidden for over 1,000 years. Her bones were stained with bright red cinnabar, a mercury-rich pigment used only in the burials of the elite. No name, no written record. Just the bones of a woman, laid to rest in a tomb meant for royalty. Her skull is elongated, her teeth filed, a Maya custom of nobility. Her body was adorned in jade. Her death was followed by ritual offerings. Nearby, the remains of two others, a young boy and an older woman, likely sacrificed to accompany her into the afterlife. So who was she? Some believe she was Tiziak Buajaw, the wife of Pakal the Great, one of the most powerful rulers of Palenque. Others argue she may have been a priestess, or even a queen in her own right. The truth? Still hidden. The silence of the tomb is not easily broken. And yet, everything about her burial speaks volumes. The cinnabar, brilliant, toxic, sacred, was believed to preserve the soul. To ensure rebirth. To transform flesh into eternity. The jade beads placed over her teeth were offerings to the gods. A plea for protection. A whisper across worlds. The Maya saw death not as an end, but as a passage. A return. Their temples were time machines, built to align with stars, solstices, and stories. Every stone was a syllable in a language of the cosmos. So you stand here, beneath the heat and vines, and feel the weight of ritual. You feel the presence of someone powerful, someone feared, revered, entombed with ceremony so meticulous it outlived empires. And yet, she remains nameless. The Red Queen's anonymity is both tragic and powerful. She defies the patriarchal record. She dares to exist without a label, as if her bones said, "You may forget my name. But you will not forget my death." Still, archaeologists try. They study DNA, facial reconstructions, burial alignment. But the Maya world remains elusive. A place of shifting masks and sacred codes. A world where rulers wore jaguar pelts and claimed descent from gods. A world where time was a spiral, not a line. As the sun dips low, shadows stretch across the temple stairs. You place your hand on the warm limestone and wonder. Was she afraid? Was she in pain? Did she believe, as her people did, that she would rise again beneath the stars? Or was this tomb her final defiance? A red scream in a silent stone chamber. A message carved not in words, but in color, bone, and myth. The jungle begins to close again. Cicadas hum like ancient prayers. You step back into the foliage, carrying her with you, not her name, but her story. And as night falls, you find yourself in a small blue house in Coyoacan, Mexico. Paint peels. The air smells of turpentine and gardenias. And in the distance, a woman lies in bed with a cigarette and a paintbrush, turning pain into color, turning heartbreak into immortality. Her name is Frida. You step softly through the tall hedges of a manicured European garden. Everything here is orderly, too orderly, perhaps. Roses trimmed with mathematical precision. Gravel paths raked to perfection. Not a blade of grass out of place. But beyond this fragile calm, there is unrest. Because behind a closed door of a quiet Prussian estate, a young girl, barely 14, is about to be told she must marry Russia. Her name is Sophie Friederich August von Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornberg. But you'll come to know her by another name, Catherine the Great. She is not royal. Not wealthy. Barely noble. But she is sharp. Observant. Ambitious in ways no one yet understands. She listens closely as her mother explains, Russia's heir, the awkward and sickly Peter III, needs a bride. Sophie has been chosen. And what does Sophie say? Nothing. She nods. She obeys. She leaves her childhood behind without a glance. Because this girl, she knows the game she's playing. When she arrives in Russia, she's met with suspicion. She's foreign, she's Lutheran, she's far too clever. The Empress Elizabeth, ruler of Russia at the time, watches her like a hawk. Sophie converts to Orthodoxy, learns Russian, changes her name to Ekaterina Alexievna, Catherine. She reads. She studies. She waits. Peter, her new husband, is a disaster. He idolizes Frederick the Great of Prussia, Russia's enemy, plays with toy soldiers, and drinks himself into incoherent rages. He mocks Catherine in public. Humiliates her in private. And makes no effort to consummate their marriage. So Catherine turns elsewhere, for love, for conversation, for strategy. She builds relationships with guards. Nobles. Intellectuals. Quietly, carefully, she constructs a web of loyalty. Years pass. Empress Elizabeth dies. Peter becomes Tsar. And immediately, he makes enemies. He alienates the army by withdrawing from Russia's hard-fought war with Prussia. He offends the church. He plans reforms that terrify the nobility. And through it all, he ignores his wife, still seeing her as a shadow in the corridor. But that shadow is about to become a storm. On July 9, 1762, while Peter is away at his summer palace, Catherine strikes. With the support of the Imperial Guard and her lover, Grigory Orlov, she marches into St. Petersburg. She is crowned empress not through inheritance, not through marriage, but by military coup. Peter is arrested. Days later, he dies in captivity. Hemorrhoidal colic, the report says. But few believe that. Most suspect Catherine's men had him quietly strangled. Now, Catherine stands alone at the center of power. And what does she do? She transforms an empire. She writes treatises on law, champions Enlightenment ideals, corresponds with Voltaire and Diderot. She establishes the Smolny Institute, the first state-funded school for girls in Russia. She builds libraries, sponsors the arts, reforms the bureaucracy. She codifies laws. Modernizes agriculture. Opens new hospitals. And yes, she also expands Russia's borders, conquering Crimea, parts of Poland, and much of the Black Sea coast. But her reign isn't pure light. She faces uprisings, like the Pugachev Rebellion, in which a Cossack peasant claims to be her dead husband Peter III and rallies thousands. Catherine crushes it with brutal efficiency. She promises to free the serfs, but doesn't. In fact, under her reign, serfdom expands. Her Enlightenment talk grows quieter as the threats to her throne grow louder. And her personal life? A battlefield of its own. Catherine takes many lovers, some powerful, some pitiful. She showers them with titles and lands, then casts them aside when they no longer serve her. Some whisper scandal. Some admire her freedom. all fear her mind. Because Catherine didn't just outlive her enemies. She outthought them. When she dies in 1796, after 34 years on the throne, she leaves behind a Russia vastly more powerful, educated, and modern than the one she inherited. But she also leaves behind a contradiction. An Enlightenment queen who ruled as an autocrat. A reformer who entrenched inequality. A woman who seized power in a world designed to keep her powerless. So as the sun sets on her garden of power and paradox, you pass into shadow again. This time, the stones beneath your feet are ancient. Jungle vines creep along a temple wall. And deep within the tomb of Palenque, a red powder stains the sarcophagus of a woman whose name we do not know. But whose story, like Catherine's, echoes beyond time. You stand now not in a jungle temple, nor in a painter's blue sanctuary, but somewhere softer. Quieter. It is a twilight place, one foot in the past, one in the dream world. A gentle hush falls here, as though the whole world has exhaled. This final story is not about queens or conquistadors, not about wars or revolutions. It is about sleep. And what happens when history meets the hush of night? You lie back, and your thoughts drift, through time, through color, through breath. The Red Queen of Palenque, wrapped in her cinnabar cocoon, stirs in your memory. Her bones were stained not just by ritual, but by reverence. In death, she became myth, an eternal mystery folded in silence. Then Frida, fractured, blazing, unbowed. Her body a battleground, her paintings a procession of truths too sharp to whisper. She left no children, but a lineage of fire. They were both women who carried pain like a scepter. Who ruled not with armies or crowns, but with presence. With voice. And now, here you are. You, listening to these stories for sleep. You, drifting along the currents of what came before. You, part of this lineage of breath, blood, and story. The world so often remembers kings, conquerors, and cathedrals. But in the shadows between great events, there are the quieter things. A jade mask. A broken spine. A paintbrush held by trembling fingers. A final exhale on a humid summer night. These are the stories too. Stories for sleep. Stories that refuse to fade. Stories that hold you close as the stars blink awake above you. You begin to slow. The breath becomes deeper. The thoughts become lighter. The journey turns inward now. Perhaps you dream of temples again, stone steps under moonlight, parrots screaming in the distance. Or maybe it's blue, deep cobalt skies, ink bleeding into canvas, a silent face staring back from the mirror. Or maybe, nothing at all. Just the quiet comfort of knowing you've walked with queens and ghosts. That you've felt the heat of history warm your skin. That you've remembered those the world tried to forget. Sleep now. Let the Red Queen rest. Let Frida's brush go still. Let your body soften into stillness. This was your story too. A whisper across centuries. A lullaby shaped like truth. A story for sleep. Good night.